In the final years of World War II, a new weapon emerged from a Harvard University laboratory that would forever change the nature of warfare. It was sticky, it burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it could not be extinguished by conventional means. This was napalm, and for Japanese soldiers defending their Pacific Island strongholds, there was no escape from its devastating reach. The story of napalm begins not on a battlefield, but in the basement of Harvard University's Converse Chemistry Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The year was 1942, and America had just entered World War II following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Professor Louis Frederick Fieser, an accomplished organic chemist, was tasked by the US Chemical Warfare Service with developing a new type of incendiary weapon. Fieser, who had already earned acclaim for his work synthesizing vitamin K and researching anti-malarial drugs, now turned his brilliant mind toward destruction. The challenge was clear. Conventional gasoline-based incendiaries evaporated too quickly and couldn't stick to targets effectively. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia had cut off America's access to natural rubber supplies from Malaya, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. Rubber that had been used to gel earlier incendiary mixtures. Fieser needed to create a synthetic alternative that could transform liquid gasoline into something that would adhere to targets and burn with sustained intensity. What made napalm revolutionary was its simplicity and effectiveness. Fieser discovered that by combining aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids, hence the name napalm, with gasoline, he could create a gel that stuck to surfaces and burned intensely for extended periods. The chemistry was elegant. The aluminum soaps reacted with the gasoline molecules to create a viscous substance that maintained its flammability, while gaining adhesive properties that made it cling to whatever it touched. On Valentine's Day 1942, Fieser perfected his formula. The substance was described as a brown, dry powder that, when mixed with gasoline at room temperature, transformed into an extremely sticky and flammable gel. One of Fieser's colleagues even suggested adding white phosphorus to the mixture, which would allow it to penetrate deeply into tissue, where it would continue to burn day after day. The implications were horrifying, but in the context of total war, such considerations took a back seat to military effectiveness. On July 4, 1942, America's first Independence Day as a combatant in World War II, Fieser conducted the first test on what is now Harvard's O'Heary Field, the university soccer field between the business school and the football stadium. Harvard staff and Cambridge Fire Department personnel stood ready as Fieser detonated 45 pounds of napalm in a water-filled pool. White phosphorus ignited the gel, sending flaming chunks through the air as tennis players on nearby courts watched in astonishment. The scene was surreal. Academic pursuit meeting military necessity on a peaceful summer day. The test was a success beyond expectations. Napalm burned 6 times hotter than thermite and adhered to surfaces until completely consumed. The gel couldn't be extinguished with water. In fact, water sometimes made it worse by spreading the burning substance. Fieser had created what would become one of the most effective and controversial weapons in military history. In his laboratory notes, he recorded the technical specifications with scientific precision, perhaps not fully grasping the human consequences his creation would unleash. Fieser later stated that when developing napalm, they never thought of any anti-personnel use. They were thinking in terms of wooden structures and factories. The weapon was conceived as a tool to destroy enemy infrastructure and manufacturing capacity. But the weapon's destiny would be far different from its creator's intentions, as is so often the case with instruments of war. Following the successful Harvard test, napalm underwent extensive military evaluation. At Jefferson Proving Ground in Indiana, researchers tested the weapon against condemned farm buildings, meticulously documenting burn patterns, temperatures, and structural damage. At Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, the military constructed entire mock villages, accurate reproductions of German and Japanese residential and industrial structures, specifically to study napalm's effectiveness. Military architects studied photographs and intelligence reports to ensure these test structures replicated the construction methods used in enemy cities. The results were devastating and, for military planners, promising. Buildings designed to replicate Japanese construction, with their paper screens, wooden frames, and tightly packed urban layouts, proved especially vulnerable to napalm attacks. The weapon burned at temperatures ranging from 800 to 200 degrees Celsius, That's 1,470 to 2,090 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than gasoline, which ignites at only 495 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, wood didn't just burn, it vaporized. Metal fixtures melted. Stone cracked from thermal shock. By 1943, napalm had been approved for frontline use. The primary delivery system became the M69 incendiary bomblet, a hexagonal device weighing 6 pounds that could be packed 38 at a time into E-46 cluster bombs. Each 500-pound cluster bomb would release its payload at altitudes between 2,000 and 2,500 feet. The M69s would punch through roofing material or impact the ground, then ignite 3 to 5 seconds later, unleashing a jet of flaming napalm gel that could shoot up to 100 feet. The delayed ignition was crucial. It meant the bomblets would be inside structures when they detonated, maximizing destruction. The genius of the M69 design was its penetration capability. It didn't just burn on the surface, it would crash through roofs into buildings before igniting, making it nearly impossible to defend against. Japanese civil defense measures, which included fire-resistant roofing materials and fire breaks, proved largely ineffective against weapons that ignited from within buildings. On December 15, 1943, napalm saw its first combat use in the Pacific Theater. American soldiers wielding napalm-fueled flamethrowers burned Japanese defenders out of a cave on Pilelo, a tiny island northeast of New Guinea. The weapon's effectiveness was immediately apparent. What conventional explosives and small arms could not achieve, napalm accomplished with terrifying efficiency. The Japanese soldiers, who had resisted grenades and gunfire, either perished in the flames or fled into American gunfire. 3 months later, on February 15, 1944, napalm bombs were first used in aerial bombardment when the US 7th Air Force attacked Pohnpei, capital of the Micronesian island of the same name. Over the next 11 days, 118 tons of napalm bombs would fall on the island, destroying Japanese installations and supply depots. Reconnaissance photos showed devastation far exceeding what conventional bombing had achieved. Commanders across the Pacific quickly recognized napalm's potential. According to official military histories, the weapon proved to be an excellent tactical weapon to use against supply dumps, troop concentrations, convoys and vehicles. But its most significant impact would be against entrenched defensive positions, the very fortifications that Japanese forces would rely on as American forces island hopped toward Japan. As the Pacific Campaign progressed, napalm became an increasingly important part of the American arsenal. To understand why napalm became so devastatingly effective against Japanese forces, we must first understand Japanese defensive tactics in the Pacific War. By 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japanese military commanders knew they could not match American firepower in open battle. Naval defeats at Midway and the Philippine Sea had crippled Japan's carrier fleet. The Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. On land, American superiority in artillery, armour and air support made traditional defensive lines untenable. The Japanese response was to go underground. On islands like Iwo Jima, Saipan, Okinawa, and throughout the Philippines, Japanese forces constructed elaborate defensive networks. Concrete bunkers reinforced with steel, interconnected by miles of tunnels, natural caves expanded and fortified, and pillboxes positioned with interlocking fields of fire. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were sophisticated fortifications that would have impressed the engineers who built the Maginot Line. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of Iwo Jima's defences, exemplified this strategy. Rather than defending the beaches, where American naval gunfire would annihilate his forces, Kuribayashi concentrated his 21,000 troops in the island's interior. His forces dug into the volcanic rock, creating a maze of over 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of fighting positions. Some tunnels ran 5 levels deep. The tunnels allowed Japanese soldiers to move between positions unseen, retreat from areas under attack, and reoccupy bunkers that Marines believed they had cleared. Ventilation shafts were carefully concealed. Command posts were buried under 75 feet of rock. Veterans described how they would clear a bunker with grenades and flamethrowers, post a guard, and move on. Half an hour later, Japanese soldiers would pop up from a tunnel and start shooting from behind. They could be anywhere, disappear anywhere. It was like fighting ghosts. The psychological toll on American forces was immense. No position was ever truly secure. These defensive positions were nearly impervious to conventional bombardment. On Iwo Jima, American ships had fired over 22,000 shells in a 3-day pre-invasion bombardment. The naval gunfire was so intense that officers believed nothing could have survived. Yet when Marines landed on February 19, 1945, Japanese defences remained largely intact. The concrete and volcanic rock absorbed the explosive force of high-explosive shells. Artillery that exploded on the surface couldn't penetrate deep enough to reach the underground fortifications. The bombardment had created a moonscape of craters, but the defenders remained largely unscathed in their underground fortress. But napalm was different. Its properties made it uniquely suited to defeating fortified positions in ways that conventional weapons could not. When American forces invaded Saipan in June 1944, they encountered the reality of Japanese underground defense for the first time at scale. The island's 30,000 Japanese defenders had constructed hundreds of caves and bunkers throughout the island's mountainous terrain. Conventional weapons proved frustratingly ineffective. Marines would spend days reducing a single fortified position, only to find the next one equally resistant to their attacks. This is where napalm entered the equation in a decisive way. American forces deployed 2 forms of napalm against Japanese positions: man-portable flamethrowers and, more significantly, flamethrower tanks. The M4A3 Sherman tanks, modified with the Navy Mark I flamethrower system and nicknamed Satan tanks, could project napalm streams up to 150 yards. At closer range, the weapon was even more devastating. The tanks provided protection for the operators while delivering far more fuel than any infantry portable system could manage. Marine veterans recalled that flame tanks were their best weapon. One battalion commander called them the best single weapon of the operation. What infantry and regular tanks couldn't accomplish in days, a flame tank could do in hours. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was also significant. The approach of a flame tank often prompted surrender or withdrawal, rare occurrences in the Pacific War. The physics of napalm made it uniquely suited to defeating fortified positions. Unlike bullets or explosive shells that could be stopped by concrete and earth, napalm was liquid. It flowed. When directed at a bunker entrance or cave opening, the burning gel would pour inside like liquid death, following the contours of the fortification, reaching into side chambers and connecting tunnels. The gel would splash against walls and ceilings, creating multiple points of ignition. Within seconds, an entire bunker system could be engulfed in flames. The weapon killed in multiple ways, each more horrifying than the last. Direct contact with burning napalm caused severe burns. The gel stuck to skin and clothing, continuing to burn until the fuel was consumed. The gel burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause catastrophic tissue damage in seconds. Victims who survived the initial exposure often died from infections or organ failure caused by their burns. The intense heat could cause death within seconds for those in the primary zone of the attack. But perhaps more significantly, napalm consumed oxygen. In an enclosed space like a bunker or cave, the napalm's fire would rapidly deplete available oxygen, while simultaneously producing deadly carbon monoxide and other toxic gases. Japanese soldiers deep inside fortifications, even those not touched by flames, would die from asphyxiation or carbon monoxide poisoning. The military termed these effects humane because death came quickly, though survivors' accounts suggest otherwise. Some soldiers were found dead at their post with no burns, killed by invisible fumes. On Saipan, American forces conducted over 600 flamethrower attacks, expending more than 200,000 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel against Japanese positions in the cliffs, hills, and escarpments. The results spoke for themselves. Positions that had resisted days of conventional assault fell within hours to flame weapons. The rocky terrain of Saipan, riddled with natural caves that Japanese forces had fortified, provided an ideal testing ground for napalm tactics. But even after Saipan, Japanese forces maintained their underground defensive strategy. They had no choice. Their alternative, meeting American forces in open combat, guaranteed swift annihilation. Japanese military doctrine emphasized death before dishonor, and commanders ordered their troops to fight to the last man. The underground fortifications at least gave them a chance to inflict maximum casualties on the attackers. If any battle demonstrated both the effectiveness of Japanese underground defences and the decisive role of napalm, it was Iwo Jima. The island, a mere 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand, held tremendous strategic value. Located just 750 miles from Tokyo, it housed Japanese early warning radar and fighter bases that could intercept American B-29 bombers. For the Americans, capturing Iwo Jima would provide an emergency landing site for damaged bombers returning from raids over Japan and a base for fighter escorts on raids against the Japanese mainland. General Kuribayashi had nearly 7 months to prepare Iwo Jima's defences after he assumed command in June 1944. By February 1945, the island bristled with over 1,500 rooms and chambers, connected by 11 miles of tunnels, reinforced with concrete and steel. Heavy artillery positions on Mount Suribachi featured armoured steel doors that opened only when firing, then immediately closed against counterfire. Some positions had multiple firing ports, allowing guns to engage targets from different angles without moving. Underground barracks housed troops in relative safety. Hospitals, ammunition storage and command posts were all buried deep in the volcanic rock. The Japanese strategy was simple but brutal. Make the Americans pay for every yard in blood. Kuribayashi forbade suicidal banzai charges, which he viewed as wasteful. Instead, he ordered his troops to fight from fortified positions, fall back through the tunnel network when overwhelmed, and counterattack when opportunities arose. Every American advance would be contested. When 30,000 Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they initially met light resistance. Japanese forces held their fire, allowing the beaches to fill with troops and equipment. Then the trap was sprung. From hidden positions across the island, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire. The beaches became killing grounds as shells and bullets cut through the tightly packed Marines. Marines struggled to advance across the volcanic ash beaches. Their landing craft couldn't gain traction on the steep slopes. The volcanic sand provided no cover, Marines couldn't dig in. As Time Life correspondent Robert Sherrod described it, the landing was simply a nightmare in hell. Casualties mounted with terrifying speed. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate the wounded, but many died on the beaches waiting for treatment. Over the next 5 weeks, Marines fought bunker by bunker, cave by cave to take the island. This is where napalm proved indispensable. Each Marine battalion was assigned 1 flamethrower per platoon, with reserve flamethrowers in each group. But handheld flamethrowers had severe limitations. Their 60-pound fuel tanks were heavy, their range was short at about 50 yards maximum, and their visible flames made operators prime targets for Japanese snipers. Flamethrower operators had one of the highest casualty rates of any military specialty. The solution was the flamethrower tank. 8 M4A3 Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers had been specially prepared for the invasion. One anonymous electrician's mate from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion, who operated one of these tanks on Iwo Jima, later wrote that one day they were assigned a pocket to burn out. They did in 6 hours with 4 loads of fuel, what a tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for 5 days. The transformation was dramatic. What had seemed an impossible objective became achievable with the right weapon. The flamethrower tanks could engage Japanese positions from relatively safe distances. The napalm stream could reach into cave entrances that were otherwise inaccessible to infantry. Most crucially, the tanks could sustain operations far longer than infantry flamethrower operators, who could empty their tanks in less than a minute of sustained firing. The tanks also provided mobile cover for infantry advancing behind them. The battle for Mount Suribachi illustrated napalm's effectiveness. For days, Marines assaulted the mountain slopes, facing fire from hidden positions. Japanese crews would open armoured steel doors to fire artillery, then immediately close them. The doors were so well engineered that they could open and close in seconds. Conventional weapons couldn't destroy these positions. Shells would bounce off the armoured doors or explode harmlessly against solid rock. Flamethrowers and napalm changed the equation. Marines using portable flamethrowers and supported by flame tanks began methodically clearing positions on the mountain's lower slopes. The heat and flames could reach into firing ports and ventilation shafts. Bunkers that had resisted for days fell to sustained flame attacks. The napalm gel would splash through openings and ignite everything inside. Some Japanese positions were silenced when napalm found their ventilation systems, filling the bunkers with flames and toxic smoke. Yet even with napalm, the cost was staggering. By February 23rd, 4 days after the invasion, American forces had suffered thousands of casualties, taking just 1/3 of the island. The volcanic rock made digging foxholes nearly impossible, so Marines had little protection from Japanese fire. Casualties among junior officers and NCOs were particularly severe as they led assaults on fortified positions. On February 23rd, Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi in what became one of the war's most iconic photographs. The image suggested victory was near. But the battle was far from over. The bulk of Japanese forces remained entrenched in the northern part of the island, where the terrain was even more challenging and the fortifications even more elaborate. For another month, Marines fought to clear the remaining Japanese positions. Every cave, every bunker required systematic reduction. The process was exhausting, terrifying, and lethal. Japanese defenders exploited their tunnel system brilliantly. Bunkers Marines had cleared and moved past would suddenly reopen fire as Japanese soldiers emerged from connecting tunnels. This tactic caused heavy casualties among American forces who believed areas were secure. Supply columns and rear area troops found themselves under attack from positions supposedly cleared days earlier. The answer was combined arms tactics: tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, and air support. But most immediately effective were flamethrowers fueled with napalm. A typical assault on a cave position went as follows. Demolition teams would first attempt to seal off tunnel entrances with explosives, trying to trap defenders inside or at least limit their mobility. Marines would then lay down suppressing fire on the cave mouth with rifles, machine guns, and occasionally artillery. A flamethrower operator, covered by riflemen, would approach as close as safely possible, usually within 25 to 50 yards. The operator would then unleash a stream of burning napalm into the cave entrance. The gel would splash against the interior walls, spreading flame deep inside the cave system. The fire consumed oxygen, created deadly carbon monoxide, and generated temperatures hot enough to make steel glow red. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima actually helped the weapon's effectiveness. The porous stone absorbed heat and radiated it back, creating an oven effect that was inescapable. Marine combat reports described how Japanese soldiers who weren't burned to death suffocated from lack of oxygen or carbon monoxide poisoning. Some would stagger out of caves with their uniforms smouldering, only to be cut down by rifle fire. Others were found dead at their posts, no visible wounds, killed by the fumes. In some cases, Marines entering cleared caves found bodies in defensive positions, weapons ready, but the men dead from asphyxiation. When flamethrowers alone couldn't reach deep cave systems, Marines improvised. They coupled lengths of fire hose together, sometimes reaching 400 feet, connecting one end to a flame tank's fuel reservoir and attaching a portable flame gun to the other end. This innovation allowed them to project napalm into caves that were otherwise completely out of range. The extended hoses allowed Marines to reach cave systems that extended deep into the island's interior, places where defenders thought they were safe from attack. But napalm, for all its effectiveness, couldn't eliminate Japanese resistance quickly. General Kuribayashi's strategy was working. Every position taken cost American lives. Japanese soldiers fought to the death, exactly as ordered. Out of 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 would be taken prisoner. The rest died in the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. Many were sealed in caves that became their tombs. Some committed suicide rather than face capture or death by flame. By March 26, 1945, 36 days after the invasion began, Iwo Jima was declared secure. But the cost was horrific. Nearly 7,000 Americans dead and 20,000 wounded. It was among the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The casualty rate was shocking. Over 30% of the invasion force became casualties. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. The experience traumatized American military planners. If a tiny island cost so dearly, what would invading the Japanese mainland demand? Casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, were staggering. Estimates ran as high as 1 million American casualties. 2 months after Iwo Jima, on April 1, 1945, American forces launched the invasion of Okinawa in Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. over 180,000 American troops would eventually land on the island. Okinawa, just 350 miles from mainland Japan, was part of the Japanese home islands. Its defense was entrusted to Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who employed tactics similar to Kuribayashi's, defense in depth, utilizing every cave, ridge, and natural fortress on the island. The battle lasted 82 days and became one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. Once again, napalm played a crucial role. Flame-throwing tank battalions conducted extensive operations against Japanese positions in southern Okinawa. More than 200,000 gallons of napalm were expended against defensive positions in cliffs, hills, and escarpments. The innovative hose extension system developed on Iwo Jima was used extensively, allowing Marines to reach deep cave complexes that honeycombed Okinawa's limestone ridges. But Okinawa introduced a new nightmare: kamikaze attacks. Japanese suicide pilots launched nearly 2,000 attacks against the invasion fleet, sinking 26 ships and damaging 164 others. The desperation of Japanese resistance, both on land and at sea, demonstrated a terrifying truth: Japan would not surrender easily. The kamikazes showed that Japanese forces would use any tactic, however desperate, to inflict casualties on the Americans. After Okinawa, American planners had casualty projections for invading the Japanese mainland. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion, would require millions of troops. Casualties were estimated at 500,000 or more Americans killed and wounded, with Japanese casualties potentially numbering in the millions. The Japanese could be expected to defend every inch of their homeland with the same fanaticism seen on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but multiplied across an entire nation. Intelligence reports suggested Japan was preparing to arm civilians with bamboo spears and train them in suicide tactics. While Marines fought cave by cave on Pacific Islands, a far larger application of napalm was underway against the Japanese homeland itself. By 1945, American B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from the Mariana Islands could reach Japan. The Marianas, captured in mid-1944, provided bases within range of all major Japanese cities. Initially, high-altitude precision bombing raids against Japanese industry had proven disappointing. Cloud cover, high winds at altitude, and the dispersed nature of Japanese war production limited their effectiveness. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Shinkansen Bomber Command, made a radical decision: switch from high-explosive bombs to incendiaries, more specifically, to napalm. LeMay was a pragmatist who believed in maximum destruction with minimum risk to American aircrews. Incendiaries offered both. American intelligence had studied Japanese urban construction extensively. Analysts noted that Japanese cities featured densely packed wooden structures with paper screens and tatami mats, essentially tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Unlike American or European cities built primarily of brick, concrete, and steel, Japanese cities were largely wooden. A devastating earthquake and fire in 1923 had demonstrated Tokyo's vulnerability, when fires following the quake killed over 100,000 people and destroyed vast sections of the city. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, Operation Meeting House commenced. It would become the single most destructive air raid in human history. 334 B-29 bombers took off from the Marianas, stripped of defensive armament to maximize bomb capacity. Each aircraft carried approximately 40 E-46 cluster bombs. That's about 1,520 Me-69 napalm bomblets per plane. In total, 279 bombers would drop 165 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The bombers attacked at night, from low altitude, just 5,000 to 9,000 feet, to improve accuracy. Flying at low altitude violated conventional bombing doctrine, but dramatically improved accuracy and reduced fuel consumption. They targeted the Shitamachi district, home to over 1.2 million people, and countless small factories that supplied components for larger Japanese war industries. American planners had identified this district as containing the highest concentration of war-related cottage industries. The weather had been carefully chosen. High winds blowing across the city would spread the fires. The bombers dropped their payloads in a specific pattern, starting upwind so the flames would be blown across the target area. The attack plan called for creating a ring of fire that would then burn inward, trapping people in the center. What followed was an inferno beyond human imagination. The M69 bomblets punched through roofs and into buildings before igniting. Within minutes, fires sprang up across 16 square miles of central Tokyo. The individual fires merged into a massive firestorm. Flames created their own weather system, a supernatural chimney of fire and smoke rising 18,000 feet into the air, visible for 150 miles. Winds generated by the fire reached hurricane force, exceeding 100 miles per hour. The firestorm created its own wind patterns, sucking air inward to feed the flames. Temperature at ground level exceeded 800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water instantly, to ignite human bodies spontaneously, to turn entire blocks into crematoria. Glass melted. Metal fixtures liquefied. Canals boiled. People who jumped into water cisterns hoping to escape the heat were boiled alive. The firestorm was so intense that it created thermal updrafts powerful enough to toss human bodies into the air. B-29 tail gunners could see the red glow of burning Tokyo from 150 miles away on their return flight. Air crews reported gagging and vomiting from the smell of burning flesh that penetrated their aircraft at altitude. Some crews requested oxygen masks not for altitude but to escape the stench. The psychological impact on the air crews was severe. Many later reported nightmares about the attack. By dawn, the fires had killed an estimated 87,793 to 100,000 people, more than died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Another 40,018 were injured, many with burns covering most of their bodies. Over 1 million people were left homeless. 267,171 buildings were destroyed. 16 square miles of Tokyo simply ceased to exist. The destruction was so complete that when reconnaissance aircraft photographed the target area the next day, entire neighborhoods had vanished. But Operation Meeting House was just the beginning. Over the following months, American bombers would conduct similar firebombing raids against 64 Japanese cities. By war's end, 2/3 of all napalm produced during World War II, approximately 14,000 tons, would be used in the Pacific Theater. Cities like Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of others suffered similar destruction. By August 1945, much of urban Japan had been reduced to ashes. The strategic bombing campaign destroyed much of Japan's remaining industrial capacity and shattered civilian morale. When Emperor Hirohito toured the destroyed areas of Tokyo in March 1945, the devastation reportedly ended his relative lack of involvement in Japanese military decision-making. The emperor, who had previously remained largely aloof from military planning, began taking a more active role in seeking a way to end the war. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The decision came after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after the Soviet Union entered the war and invaded Manchuria. But historians note that the decision to surrender was influenced by multiple factors, including the systematic destruction of Japanese cities by firebombing. The napalm raids had demonstrated that no Japanese city was safe, that conventional weapons could create destruction rivaling atomic bombs. For Japanese soldiers who fought in the Pacific Islands, napalm had proven inescapable. The elaborate cave and bunker systems that rendered conventional weapons ineffective could not stop burning gel that flowed like liquid, consumed oxygen, and generated lethal temperatures and fumes. 2/3 of the napalm used in World War II was deployed against Japanese forces and Japanese cities. The weapon had proven devastatingly effective against an enemy who refused to surrender. But what were the human costs? Japanese survivors of napalm attacks bore horrific injuries, burns covering much of their bodies, scarring that lasted lifetimes, respiratory damage from inhaling superheated air and toxic fumes. Many died slow, agonizing deaths days or weeks after exposure. Japanese hospitals were overwhelmed with burn victims, lacking adequate supplies to treat such massive casualties. American servicemen who used napalm or witnessed its effects had mixed reactions. Many saw it as a necessary weapon that saved American lives by ending battles more quickly. Others were haunted by what they had seen and done. Some veterans later spoke of nightmares about burning men staggering from caves. Others refused to discuss their experiences with flamethrowers at all. Louis Fieser, napalm's inventor, initially took pride in his creation. He believed he had helped end the war and saved American lives. During the war years, he was something of a celebrity at Harvard. Students wore sweatshirts bearing his face, and he was celebrated as a war hero, who wielded test tubes instead of rifles. But as years passed and napalm's use continued in Korea and Vietnam, Fiese's views grew more complicated. When he learned in 1972 that napalm had killed and maimed civilians in Vietnam, including the famous photograph of the burned Vietnamese girl running down a road, he wrote to President Nixon suggesting that international agreements should outlaw the weapon's use. In 1973, Fiese said he had no right to judge the morality of napalm just because he invented it. He couldn't foresee that this substance was going to be used against babies and civilians. He compared himself to a rifle manufacturer. The person who makes a rifle isn't responsible if it is used to shoot the president. Yet he also said he didn't think he had to be ashamed of having made that discovery. His ambivalence reflected the complex moral terrain that weapons developers occupy. Today, more than 80 years after napalm's creation, we can look back and assess its impact on the Pacific War and warfare more broadly. The numbers tell part of the story. An estimated 87,500 killed in Tokyo alone, hundreds of thousands more in other Japanese cities, countless Japanese soldiers incinerated in caves and bunkers across the Pacific Islands. American casualties on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa ran into the tens of thousands, but military historians argue those numbers would have been far higher without napalm's ability to neutralize fortified positions. Napalm was a weapon of its time. The Japanese defensive strategy of fighting to the death from underground fortifications created a tactical problem that conventional weapons couldn't solve efficiently. Napalm solved that problem. Was it humane? War is never humane. Was it effective? Absolutely. The moral calculus of warfare often reduces to such stark equations. In 1980, the United Nations adopted Protocol 3 of the Convention on certain conventional weapons, which prohibits the use of incendiary weapons like napalm against civilian populations. However, using napalm against military targets remains legal under international law. As of 2023, 126 countries have ratified Protocol 3. Napalm has been used in subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and others, but its reputation has been permanently scarred, particularly by its widespread use in Vietnam, where televised images brought the weapon's effects into American living rooms. For Japanese soldiers who faced napalm in the Pacific War, there was ultimately no effective defense. Their courage was not in question. They fought with extraordinary determination and sacrifice. Japanese soldiers displayed a willingness to die for their emperor that impressed even their enemies. But against a weapon that could flow into their caves, consume the oxygen in their bunkers, and generate temperatures that could kill instantly, their fortifications provided little protection. The same qualities that made Japanese underground defences so effective against conventional weapons, the narrow entrances, the enclosed spaces, the limited ventilation, made them death traps when napalm was employed. The fortifications that were meant to protect Japanese soldiers became ovens that incinerated them. The deeper the fortification, the more effective napalm became, as the enclosed spaces concentrated heat and toxic fumes. Today, the battlefields where napalm played such a decisive role are peaceful. On Iwo Jima, now returned to Japanese administration and known by its Japanese name Iwoto, the caves and bunkers remain, many still containing the remnants of the men who died there. The island is largely off-limits to visitors, a memorial to the dead of both nations. At Okinawa, memorial parks commemorate both Japanese and American dead, acknowledging the terrible cost paid by both sides. The story of napalm in the Pacific War is ultimately a story about the extremes of warfare, about human ingenuity turned toward destruction, about the moral complexities of weapons designed to make killing more efficient. For Japanese soldiers defending their positions, for American Marines attacking those positions, and for the civilians caught between them, napalm represented the pitiless reality of total war, a reality where survival often depended not on courage or skill, but simply on not being in the wrong place when burning gel rained from the sky or flowed into your shelter. Louis Fiese created napalm believing it would be used against structures, to end the war more quickly, to save American lives. It accomplished those goals, at a cost measured in hundreds of thousands of deaths and immeasurable human suffering. The weapon proved so effective that it became a standard part of the American military arsenal, used in every conflict from World War II through the present day in various forms. Modern thermobaric weapons and improved incendiaries trace their lineage directly back to Fiese's Harvard laboratory. Whether that cost was justified remains debated to this day. Some argue that napalm shortened the war and ultimately saved lives by making an invasion of Japan unnecessary. Others contend that the mass killing of civilians and the horrific nature of death by fire crossed moral lines that should never be breached, regardless of military necessity. What cannot be debated is this: once napalm entered the equation, Japanese soldiers in their fortified positions found that even the strongest defences could not protect them from a weapon that turned their shelters into ovens. The development and use of napalm also raises profound questions about the relationship between scientific research and military application. Fieser was a brilliant chemist, working on what he believed was a legitimate military problem. Yet his solution created a weapon that would kill hundreds of thousands and inflict terrible suffering on countless more. The question of scientific responsibility, whether researchers bear moral culpability for how their discoveries are used, has only grown more urgent in the decades since World War II. 8 decades later, the burns have healed into scars and the survivors grow fewer with each passing year. The last veterans of the Pacific War are now in their late 90s or older. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers the reality of those battles, who can describe the smell of napalm or the sounds of men dying in burning caves. But the lessons remain about the weapons we create, about the wars we fight, and about the human costs that statistics can never fully capture. This was napalm's war, fought in caves on volcanic islands, in the streets of burning cities, in the terrible mathematics of modern warfare where one weapon, developed in a university laboratory, could change the course of history and claim more lives than any atomic bomb. The irony is stark. While Hiroshima and Nagasaki became synonymous with weapons of mass destruction, more people died in a single night of napalm bombing in Tokyo than in either atomic attack. Yet napalm never acquired the same infamy, perhaps because its destruction came from conventional chemistry rather than splitting atoms. The Japanese soldiers couldn't escape napalm's devastation. Their commanders had made a strategic choice to fight from fortified positions, believing this would maximize American casualties and perhaps convince the United States to negotiate rather than invade Japan. They were partially correct. American casualties on islands like Iwo Jima were horrific, but they could not have anticipated napalm's specific effectiveness against their defensive strategy. The very fortifications meant to protect them became death chambers when napalm was introduced. Perhaps we can learn from their fate and from the terrible effectiveness of the weapon that defeated them. Lessons about restraint, about the limits of acceptable warfare, and about the responsibility that comes with creating weapons too effective for their own good. The international protocols that now restrict incendiary weapons represent a recognition that some methods of killing are so horrible that they should be prohibited even in war. Yet these restrictions remain incomplete and imperfectly enforced. The story of napalm also illustrates how technological advantage in warfare can overcome even the most determined resistance. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima and Okinawa fought with extraordinary courage and tenacity. Their defensive preparations were masterful. Yet all their efforts could not overcome a fundamental technological disparity. American industrial and scientific capacity produced a weapon specifically suited to defeating Japanese tactics. This pattern, where technological innovation overcomes tactical or strategic advantages, has repeated throughout military history and continues to shape modern warfare. For the families of the Japanese soldiers who died in those caves, closure has been difficult. Many bodies were never recovered, sealed in collapsed tunnels or buried under tons of volcanic rock. Some families never learned exactly how their loved ones died. The caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa remain largely unexplored, still containing the remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Occasionally, even today, remains are discovered and returned to families for proper burial, providing a measure of peace after 8 decades. The civilians who survived the napalm raids on Japanese cities faced their own struggles. Many lost entire families in the firestorms. Survivors often bore visible scars that marked them as hibakusha, explosion-affected people, though this term is more commonly associated with atomic bomb survivors. The social stigma attached to these scars, combined with lasting health problems from burn injuries and smoke inhalation, meant that survivors suffered for decades after the war ended. American veterans who used napalm against Japanese positions had complex feelings about their experiences. Many emphasized that they were fighting an enemy who refused to surrender, who would fight to the death, and who had committed their own atrocities throughout Asia. They saw napalm as a tool that allowed them to survive and complete their mission. yet some also expressed regret about the weapon's effects, particularly when they witnessed its impact firsthand. The ethical questions surrounding napalm's use extend beyond the weapon itself to the broader strategic bombing campaign against Japan. The decision to target urban areas, knowing that civilian casualties would be massive, represented a significant shift in American military policy. Earlier in the war, the United States had criticized German and Japanese bombing of civilian targets. By 1945, American bombers were deliberately creating firestorms in densely populated Japanese cities. This shift reflected the logic of total war, where the distinction between combatants and civilians becomes blurred. Japanese cottage industries that produced war materials were located in residential neighborhoods. Targeting these industries meant targeting neighborhoods, yet this logic could justify almost unlimited violence against civilian populations, a troubling precedent that would influence military thinking in subsequent conflicts. The Napalm campaign against Japan also demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of modern industrial warfare. The United States could produce napalm in enormous quantities, deliver it with precision using B-29 bombers, and systematically destroy Japanese cities one by one. This combination of industrial production, technological sophistication, and strategic planning represented a new form of warfare that emphasized destruction of the enemy's capacity to resist, rather than traditional battlefield victories. In many ways, the use of napalm against Japanese forces and cities was a preview of Cold War military strategy, where the emphasis shifted from occupying territory to destroying the enemy's ability to fight. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki overshadowed the napalm campaign in historical memory, but the firebombing campaign had already demonstrated that American forces could destroy Japanese cities at will using conventional weapons. The legacy of napalm extends far beyond World War II. The weapon saw extensive use in the Korean War, where it was again employed against fortified positions and in close air support missions. But it was in Vietnam that napalm became truly infamous. Television brought images of napalm strikes into American living rooms. The famous photograph of Phan Thi Kim Phuc, a 9-year-old girl running naked down a road after being burned by napalm, became an iconic anti-war image. The photograph forced Americans to confront the reality of what napalm did to human bodies. The controversy over napalm use in Vietnam led to the development of international humanitarian law restrictions on incendiary weapons. Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980, was a direct response to the public outcry over napalm's use. The protocol prohibits using incendiary weapons against civilian populations or against military targets located within civilian concentrations. However, the protocol has significant limitations. It doesn't ban incendiary weapons entirely, and not all nations have ratified it. Modern militaries have largely moved away from napalm not because of moral objections, but because more sophisticated weapons have been developed. Precision-guided munitions can destroy specific targets with less collateral damage. Thermobaric weapons, which create intense heat and pressure through explosive chemical reactions, can clear fortified positions without the same public relations problems associated with napalm. Yet these modern weapons still trace their conceptual origins to the principles that made napalm effective, using heat, pressure, and oxygen deprivation to kill in enclosed spaces. The scientific principles that made napalm effective, creating a gel that adheres to surfaces and burns intensely, have also found peaceful applications. Fire retardants used to fight wildfires work on similar principles, though obviously designed to suppress rather than spread fire. The chemistry of polymer gels has applications in everything from cosmetics to medicine. Yet these peaceful uses cannot erase napalm's primary purpose and its terrible effectiveness as a weapon of war. For historians studying the Pacific War, napalm represents a crucial turning point in military technology and tactics. The weapon's development showed how quickly scientific research could be translated into battlefield application when properly funded and prioritized. The Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb is better known, but the Napalm project proceeded on a faster timeline and arguably had more immediate battlefield impact. While the atomic bombs ended the war, napalm had been systematically destroying Japanese cities and military positions for months before Hiroshima. The story of napalm also highlights the importance of understanding your enemy's tactics and adapting accordingly. American forces recognized that Japanese underground defensive tactics required new weapons. Rather than simply accepting higher casualties, American military planners sought technological solutions. This approach, using technological innovation to solve tactical problems, has become a hallmark of American military doctrine, for better or worse. Yet the reliance on technological solutions can also create moral hazards. Napalm allowed American forces to kill Japanese soldiers efficiently, without exposing American troops to as much danger. This capability made the weapon militarily valuable, but also made killing easier, more impersonal, and potentially more indiscriminate. The pilot dropping napalm bombs from 5,000 feet doesn't see the people burning below. This distance between killer and killed has only increased with modern weapons like drones and cruise missiles. The Japanese experience with napalm also illustrates the limits of defensive tactics when facing an enemy with overwhelming technological and industrial advantages. Japanese commanders made rational decisions based on the resources available to them. Underground fortifications maximized their defensive advantages while minimizing their weaknesses in firepower and air support. But they couldn't anticipate every technological development. Napalm exploited vulnerabilities in their defensive strategy that they hadn't recognized. This pattern repeats throughout military history. A defensive innovation is countered by an offensive innovation, which leads to new defensive measures, and so on. The fortified positions that protected Japanese soldiers from artillery became death traps when napalm was introduced. Similarly, castle walls that protected medieval defenders became obsolete when cannons were developed. Military technology drives a constant cycle of innovation and counter-innovation. For the American forces fighting in the Pacific, napalm represented hope. The weapon offered a way to reduce casualties and end battles more quickly. Marines who had watched friends die assaulting bunkers that seemed indestructible saw flamethrower tanks as salvation. The complicated moral questions about napalm's use were secondary to the immediate question of survival. This perspective, that saving American lives justified using terrible weapons, reflected the stark calculations of total war. Yet some American servicemen recognized even then that napalm crossed ethical lines. Letters and diaries from the period show that some soldiers were troubled by what they witnessed. The smell, the sounds, the sight of burned bodies, these things haunted some veterans for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact of using such weapons has only recently begun to be studied seriously as part of understanding combat trauma. The Japanese soldiers who faced napalm attacks displayed remarkable courage and discipline. Cut off from resupply, facing overwhelming firepower, knowing they would receive no reinforcements, they continued fighting. Their willingness to die rather than surrender was influenced by Japanese military culture, fear of American treatment of prisoners, and orders from commanders. Yet this determination to fight to the death also made them particularly vulnerable to weapons like napalm that could kill without requiring close combat. The tragedy of the Pacific War was that both sides were locked into strategies that maximized casualties. Japanese defensive tactics and refusal to surrender meant that every position had to be taken by force. American forces responded with overwhelming firepower and technological innovation. The result was battles of extraordinary brutality, where the only outcome was near total annihilation of the defenders. Napalm was both a product and accelerant of this brutal dynamic. Looking back from the perspective of 2025, it's difficult to imagine the world of 1945. Total war between industrialized nations, where civilian casualties numbered in the millions and entire cities could be destroyed in a single night, seems almost incomprehensible. Yet this was the reality of World War II. Napalm was just one weapon among many designed to maximize destruction. What made it distinctive was its specific effectiveness against a particular enemy's defensive tactics. The men who developed napalm, who produced it in factories, who loaded it into bombs, who dropped it from aircraft, and who used flamethrowers in close combat were all part of a vast industrial and military system focused on a single goal: defeating Japan. Each person played a small role in this system. This diffusion of responsibility is characteristic of modern warfare and raises difficult questions about accountability and moral agency. Louis Fieser, working in his Harvard laboratory, couldn't have known exactly how his creation would be used. Yet he knew he was developing a weapon meant to burn enemy positions. The factory workers who produced napalm knew they were making weapons of war. The bomber crews knew their missions would kill people. The flamethrower operators saw the effects of their weapons firsthand. Each person had to make their own moral accommodation with their role in this system of destruction. The question of whether using napalm was morally justified cannot be answered definitively. Those who argue it was justified point to the alternative, a conventional invasion of Japan that might have cost millions of lives, Japanese and American. They argue that napalm shortened the war and ultimately reduced total suffering. Those who argue against its use point to the horrific deaths of civilians in firebombed cities, the terrible suffering inflicted on burn victims, and the ethical principle that some weapons are so inhumane they should never be used regardless of military advantage. What we can say with certainty is that napalm was devastatingly effective at accomplishing its military objectives. It neutralized Japanese fortified positions that conventional weapons could not destroy. It destroyed Japanese cities and industrial capacity. It contributed to the psychological pressure that eventually led to Japan's surrender. Whether this effectiveness justified its use remains a matter of individual moral judgment. The legacy of napalm continues to shape debates about military ethics and the laws of war. Every new weapon technology raises similar questions. Does its military effectiveness justify its humanitarian cost? Where is the line between acceptable and unacceptable methods of warfare? Who decides? These questions have no easy answers, but the history of napalm in World War II provides a case study in the moral complexities of modern warfare. As we conclude this examination of napalm's role in the Pacific War, we return to where we began. Japanese soldiers in their fortified positions, facing a weapon they could not escape. Their story is one of courage and sacrifice, but also of the futility of defensive tactics against overwhelming technological advantage. They fought bravely for a cause they believed in, using every advantage their terrain and engineering could provide. Yet in the end, they could not escape napalm's devastation. Their deaths, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in firebombed cities, stand as testament to the terrible destructive power of modern warfare. The weapon developed in a Harvard laboratory claimed more lives than most battles in human history. This fact should give us pause as we consider the weapons being developed today and the wars that might be fought tomorrow. The story of napalm is not just history, it's a warning. It shows how quickly scientific innovation can be weaponized, how easily moral constraints can be eroded in wartime, and how terrible the consequences can be when technology and warfare combine. As we face new military technologies, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, the lessons of napalm remain relevant. We must ask not just what weapons we can create, but what weapons we should create and how they should be used. For the Japanese soldiers who died in caves and bunkers across the Pacific, and for the civilians who perished in firestorms over Japanese cities, these questions come too late. But their deaths need not be meaningless if we learn from history and work to prevent such destruction in future conflicts. This is perhaps the most important lesson of napalm's war, that technological capability is not the same as moral justification, and that the weapons we create have consequences far beyond what we can imagine.